You know that feeling when someone tries to control every aspect of your life? When they think they have the power to dictate how you live, what you do, and even what color your own house can be. Well, let me tell you about Margaret Henderson, the HOA president who thought she could push me around. Spoiler alert, she was dead wrong. My name is David, and I've been living in Willowbrook Estates for exactly 3 years, 2 months, and 15 days. Not that I'm counting or anything. When my wife Sarah and I first moved here, we thought we'd found paradise. Perfect lawns, pristine sidewalks, and houses that looked like they belonged in a magazine. What we didn't realize was that we'd actually moved into a dictatorship disguised as a neighborhood. Let me paint you a picture of what life was like before the Great Shutter War of 2024. Sarah and I had just gotten married, and we were living our American dream. We'd saved every penny for years, working double shifts, skipping vacations, eating ramen for dinner more nights than I care to admit. All for this moment, owning our first home. The house we bought wasn't just any house. It was the house. White colonial with black shutters, a red front door, and a picket fence that Sarah had dreamed about since she was little. She used to sit on the front porch every morning with her coffee, watching the sunrise and talking about all the memories we'd make there. The way her eyes lit up when she looked at those shutters. God, it breaks my heart just thinking about it. But here's the thing about dreams, sometimes they come with a price you never saw coming. Margaret Henderson. Even saying her name leaves a bitter taste in my mouth. Picture this, a woman in her late 60s with silver hair pulled back so tight it could cut glass, wearing pearls at 7 a.m., and carrying a clipboard like it's a weapon of mass destruction. She's the kind of person who measures her grass with a ruler and calls the city if your garbage can is 2 inches too far from the curb. Margaret had been HOA president for 12 consecutive years. 12. And in those 12 years, she'd perfected the art of making people's lives miserable under the guise of maintaining property values. She had a violation notice for everything: mailbox too shiny, garden gnome too tall, car parked 3 minutes past the overnight parking deadline. But Margaret had never met someone like me. It was a Tuesday morning in March when everything changed. I was getting ready for work, running late as usual, when I heard Sarah gasp from the kitchen window. "David," she called, her voice shaking. "You need to see this." I rushed over, and there she was, Margaret Henderson, standing in our driveway with her clipboard, taking photos of our house like she was documenting a crime scene. But she wasn't just taking random photos. She was focused on one specific thing: our shutters. Our beautiful, perfect, regulation black shutters that had been that exact same color since the day we moved in. I watched through the window as Margaret pulled out a color wheel, an actual color wheel, and held it up against our shutters. She shook her head disapprovingly, made some notes, and then did something that made my blood boil. She walked up to our front door and left a bright orange violation notice. My hands were trembling as I read it: violation notice #247-2024 property owner, David Mitchell, address, 1247, Maple Street violation. Shutters are painted in non-compliant color, midnight black instead of approved charcoal black, correction required. Repaint all shutters to approved color within 48 hours or face daily fines of $100. Margaret Henderson, HOA president. I read it 3 times before the words actually sank in. Non-compliant color? These shutters had been this color for 3 years. Not once, had anyone said anything about them being the wrong shade of black. Sarah found me sitting at the kitchen table, staring at that orange piece of paper like it was a death sentence. When she read it, I watched her face crumble. All those dreams, all those mornings on the porch, all those plans we'd made, it was like watching them all disappear in real time. "I don't understand," she whispered, tears starting to form in her eyes. "They're black. They've always been black. How can they be the wrong black?" That's when something inside me snapped. Not the angry kind of snap, the determined kind. The kind that happens when you realize you've been pushed too far, and you're not going to take it anymore. I looked at my wife, my beautiful, kind, gentle wife who had never hurt anyone in her life, crying over some power-hungry woman's need to control the exact shade of black on our shutters, and I made a decision that would change everything. "Honey," I said, taking her hands in mine, "don't worry about this. I've got an idea." That night, after Sarah went to bed, I did something I'd never done before in my 3 years of living under Margaret's iron fist. I read the HOA bylaws. All 847 pages of them. Most people would have given up after page 10. The document was written in the kind of legal jargon that makes your eyes bleed and your brain shut down. But I was motivated. I was a man on a mission. And by 3 a.m., I had found exactly what I was looking for. Buried deep in section 127, subsection 14, paragraph C, was this beautiful little clause: exterior paint colors must be selected from the approved color palette. However, property owners may petition for alternative colors under special circumstances, provided said colors meet community aesthetic standards and receive approval from the Architectural Review Board. But here's the kicker, and the part Margaret had conveniently forgotten to mention in her violation notice: the Architectural Review Board hadn't met in over 2 years because they couldn't maintain a quorum. And according to Section 89, subsection 3, if the ARB couldn't convene within 30 days of a petition, the decision automatically defaulted to, wait for it, the homeowner's choice. I literally laughed out loud at 3:17 a.m., probably waking up half the neighborhood. Margaret Henderson, in her eagerness to flex her power, had just handed me the keys to the kingdom. The next morning, I called in sick to work. Sarah thought I was having a breakdown, and honestly, maybe I was. But it was the good kind of breakdown, the kind that leads to revolution. My first stop was the hardware store. Not just any hardware store, I drove 45 minutes to the specialty paint shop downtown. The kind of place where they can mix any color your heart desires. I need the brightest, most eye-catching, most impossible to ignore pink you've ever created, I told Jake, the paint specialist who looked like he'd seen everything in his 30 years behind the counter. Jake raised an eyebrow. How bright are we talking here? Bright enough to be seen from space. Bright enough to make flamingos jealous. I want a pink so pink that it makes other pinks look beige. Jake grinned. I like your style. Give me an hour. When Jake showed me the sample, I knew I'd found perfection. It wasn't just pink, it was pink. Electric, neon, glow-in-the-dark, stop-traffic pink. The kind of color that doesn't exist in nature because nature isn't that brave. What do you call this masterpiece? I asked. Flamingo's Revenge, Jake said with pride. It's got a slight metallic base, so it actually shimmers in the sunlight. Fair warning though, once this is on your house, there's no pretending it's not there. That's exactly what I'm counting on. While the paint was being mixed, I drove to the HOA office to file my petition. Margaret wasn't there, probably out measuring someone's grass, but her assistant Linda was. Linda was the polar opposite of Margaret, sweet, helpful, and genuinely interested in following the actual rules instead of making them up as she went along. I'd like to file a petition for alternative exterior paint colors, I said, handing her the paperwork I'd carefully prepared. Linda looked surprised. Oh. Well, this is unusual. We haven't had one of these in, well, ever. Let me get the proper forms. As she rummaged through filing cabinets that clearly hadn't been touched in years, I couldn't help but smile. This was going better than I'd hoped. Here we go, Linda said, pulling out a dusty folder. You'll need Form 127A, Form 127B, and, oh dear, it looks like you'll need to present this to the Architectural Review Board. When's their next meeting? I asked innocently. Linda checked her calendar, then her computer, then made a few phone calls. After 20 minutes, she hung up with a puzzled expression. Well, this is embarrassing. It seems the ARB hasn't met in quite some time. 2 of the members moved away, and 1 passed away last year. We're down to just 1 member, and you need at least 3 for a quorum. So what happens to my petition? Linda flipped through the bylaws manual, muttering to herself as she searched for the answer. Finally, she looked up with a shocked expression. According to Section 89, if the ARB can't convene within 30 days, the petition is automatically approved. I had to bite my lip to keep from grinning. So I can paint my shutters any color I want. As long as you filed the proper petition, yes, it appears so. I drove home with 12 gallons of Flamingo's Revenge and a heart full of mischievous joy. Sarah was in the garden when I pulled up, and she came over to help me unload the paint. David, what's all this? And why are you smiling like that? I set down the paint cans and took her hands. Sweetheart, I need you to trust me on this. Can you do that? She looked at the paint cans, then at me, then back at the paint cans. David Mitchell, what are you planning? Something that's going to make Margaret Henderson very, very sorry she messed with us. That evening, I got to work. Not painting, not yet. First, I had to prep. And by prep, I mean I had to make sure every neighbor on our street knew exactly what was about to happen and why. See, here's something Margaret never understood about power: real power doesn't come from fear and intimidation. Real power comes from people choosing to stand with you because they believe you're right. I started with Tom and Elena, our next-door neighbors. They'd been dealing with Margaret's harassment for 5 years, ever since she decided their rose bushes were too exuberant for the neighborhood aesthetic. You're really going to do it? Tom asked after I explained my plan. I'm really going to do it. Elena started laughing. Oh my God, Margaret is going to lose her mind. That's the idea. By the end of the evening, I'd talked to 14 families on our street. 14 families who had their own Margaret stories, their own violation notices, their own moments of feeling powerless against the HOA machine. And every single one of them was ready to support what I was about to do. Mrs. Patterson, the sweet elderly lady 3 houses down, even offered to help paint. I haven't caused trouble in 40 years, she said with a twinkle in her eye. I think I'm overdue. The night before the 48-hour deadline, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was nervous, I was excited. More excited than I'd been about anything in years. Sarah was tossing and turning too, and finally, around midnight, she rolled over and looked at me. Are you sure about this? She asked. More sure than I've ever been about anything. Even marrying me? I kissed her forehead. Well, that's a close second. She laughed, and in that laugh, I heard something I hadn't heard in weeks: pure, uninhibited joy. Margaret Henderson had been slowly sucking the happiness out of our lives, and I was about to put a stop to it. Sarah, can I tell you something? Of course. These last few weeks, watching you worry about the house, seeing you second-guess every little thing about our home because of Margaret's intimidation tactics, it's been breaking my heart. This isn't about the shutters anymore. This is about us taking our lives back. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that made me fall in love with her all over again. Paint them pink, David. Paint them the pinkest pink that's ever existed. I woke up at 5 a.m. on the day of reckoning. The morning was perfect: clear sky, light breeze, and enough sunlight to make Flamingo's Revenge shimmer like the weapon of mass distraction it was about to become. Tom knocked on my door at 5:30 with a cup of coffee and a paintbrush. Figured you could use some help, he said. By 6 a.m., half the neighborhood was in my front yard. Mrs. Patterson showed up with homemade muffins. The Johnsons brought their ladder. Even the teenagers from down the street came by to watch the show. It was like a block party, except instead of celebrating a holiday, we were celebrating rebellion. The first brush stroke was magical. Not just because of the color, though holy cow, that color was something else, but because of what it represented. With each stroke, I could feel the weight of Margaret's intimidation lifting off my shoulders. The neighbors cheered when the first shutter was completely covered. Flamingo's Revenge was even more spectacular than I'd imagined. It wasn't just pink, it was a statement. It was defiance in paint form. It was beautiful. Sarah came out around 8 a.m. with her coffee and just stood there, staring at the shutters with the biggest smile I'd ever seen on her face. "They're perfect," she said. And they were. They were absolutely, ridiculously, gloriously perfect. At 9:23 a.m., Margaret Henderson's white Buick came screeching around the corner. I saw her through the car window, and the look on her face was worth every penny I'd spent on that paint. She got out of her car, clipboard in hand, and just stood there for a full 30 seconds, staring at my house like she was trying to process what she was seeing. "David Mitchell," she finally screamed across the yard. "What have you done?" I set down my paintbrush, wiped my hands on my jeans, and walked over to her with the calmest smile I could manage. "Good morning, Margaret. I repainted my shutters, just like you asked. Those are not regulation colors." "Actually," I said, pulling out my petition paperwork, "they are now." What happened next was the most satisfying moment of my entire adult life. I watched Margaret's face go through about 17 different emotions as she read my petition, the HOA bylaws I'd highlighted, and the automatic approval documentation Linda had given me. This can't be legal," she sputtered. "It's completely legal. In fact, it's your own bylaws that made it possible." Margaret looked around at all the neighbors who had gathered to watch the show. Her usual intimidation tactics weren't going to work with an audience of people who were clearly on my side. "You think you're clever," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "But I'll find a way to shut this down. There has to be something in the bylaws about aesthetic disruption or community standards or—" "Margaret," I said, stepping closer, "let me save you some time. I've read all 847 pages of those bylaws. 3 times. There's nothing you can do." That's when Mrs. Patterson started clapping. Slowly at first, then faster. Soon, the entire crowd was applauding, and Margaret Henderson, the woman who had terrorized this neighborhood for over a decade, was standing in the middle of it all, completely powerless. Tom stepped forward. "Margaret, David's not the only one who's been reading the bylaws. Did you know that HOA presidents are supposed to be elected every 2 years? You've been in office for 12 years without a single election." Elena joined in. "And did you know that violation notices are supposed to include photographic evidence and specific bylaw citations? Half the notices you've issued don't meet the legal requirements." One by one, my neighbors started sharing their own discoveries about Margaret's abuse of power. It was like watching a dam break. Years of suppressed frustration and intimidation finally had an outlet. Margaret tried to maintain her composure, but you could see her authority crumbling in real time. She clutched her clipboard like a life preserver, looking around desperately for someone to support her. "This isn't over," she said, but her voice had lost all its bite. "Yes, it is," I replied. "And Margaret? Next time you want to harass someone about their house, make sure you actually know what the rules say first." She stormed back to her car, slammed the door, and drove off. The neighborhood erupted in cheers. The rest of that day was incredible. Word spread through social media about the pink shutters and the HOA showdown. Cars were driving by all afternoon just to see the house. Some people even stopped to take pictures. But the best part wasn't the attention, it was watching Sarah. She spent the entire day on the front porch, just like she used to, but now she was radiant. She was proud of our house again, proud of our shutters, proud of what we'd accomplished together. "You know what I love most about them," she said as we sat together that evening, watching the shutters catch the last light of the day. "What's that?" "They're ours. Finally, completely, unapologetically ours." Over the next few weeks, something amazing happened. Other neighbors started making changes to their houses too. The Johnsons painted their front door bright blue. Mrs. Patterson planted wildflowers instead of the regulation roses. The teenagers down the street installed a basketball hoop that was definitely not in the approved recreation equipment catalog. It was like the whole neighborhood had woken up from a long, beige sleep. Of course, Margaret didn't give up easily. She spent the next month trying to find loopholes. Technicalities, anything that would let her force me to repaint the shutters. She even hired a lawyer, which was probably the most expensive mistake she ever made. The lawyer took one look at my documentation and told her she didn't have a case. Not only that, but if she continued to harass me about the shutters, I could file a complaint against the HOA for selective enforcement and abuse of power. Margaret's reign of terror was officially over. Remember how Tom mentioned that Margaret was supposed to face elections every 2 years? Well, it turns out that when you actually follow the HOA bylaws, a lot of things have to change. We held our first HOA election in over a decade that October. Margaret ran, of course, but so did 5 other people, including Elena and Mrs. Patterson. Margaret lost by the widest margin in HOA election history. Elena won by a landslide on a platform of common sense and community over control and compliance. Under Elena's leadership, the HOA became what it was supposed to be, a group of neighbors working together to maintain and improve our community. Instead of looking for violations, we started looking for ways to help each other. We organized block parties, community gardens, and neighborhood improvement projects. Property values actually went up, not because we were all forced to have identical houses, but because we had created a community that people actually wanted to live in. You know, people often ask me if I regret painting the shutters pink. If I think it was too extreme, too confrontational, too much. And my answer is always the same: I regret waiting so long to do it. See, this story isn't really about shutters or paint colors or even HOA drama. It's about something much more important. It's about the moment you decide to stop letting other people control your life. For 3 years, I let Margaret Henderson make me feel like a guest in my own home. I let her intimidation tactics convince me that keeping the peace was more important than standing up for what was right. I watched her steal little pieces of joy from my wife, from my neighbors, from our entire community, and I did nothing. But that Tuesday morning, when I saw Sarah crying over that violation notice, something fundamental changed in me. I realized that being comfortable isn't worth being controlled. That being accepted isn't worth being afraid. That sometimes, the most responsible thing you can do is cause a little trouble. The pink shutters taught me something I'll never forget: most bullies, no matter how powerful they seem, are counting on you not to fight back. They're banking on your politeness, your desire to avoid conflict, your assumption that they must know something you don't. But when you actually stand up, when you do your homework and call their bluff, when you refuse to be intimidated, that's when you discover that most of their power was just an illusion. Margaret Henderson seemed invincible because no one had ever seriously challenged her. She'd been getting away with abusing her position for so long that she'd forgotten there were actually rules she was supposed to follow too. The story of the pink shutters spread beyond our neighborhood. I started getting emails from people all over the country who were dealing with their own Margaret Hendersons, power-hungry HOA presidents, controlling landlords, bullying neighbors, micromanaging bosses. And the message was always the same: thank you for showing us that it's possible to fight back. That's when I realized this story was bigger than me, bigger than my shutters, bigger than one small victory over one petty tyrant. It was about inspiring people to stand up for themselves, to question authority when authority is wrong, and to remember that courage is contagious. Fighting back changed me in ways I never expected. I became more confident, more willing to speak up when something was wrong, more aware of my own power to create change. Sarah noticed it too. She said I started carrying myself differently, like I'd remembered who I was supposed to be. But the most important change was in our marriage. Going through that experience together, supporting each other through the uncertainty and the backlash, standing united against someone who was trying to diminish us, it made us stronger as a couple. We learned that we could trust each other completely, even when the plan seemed crazy. We learned that we were willing to fight for what mattered to us. We learned that our partnership was unbreakable. 2 years later, Willowbrook Estates is completely different. We still have standards, we still want our neighborhood to be beautiful and well-maintained. But now those standards come from a place of pride and cooperation, not fear and compliance. Kids play in the streets without worrying about getting their parents in trouble for noise violations. Neighbors help each other with yard work instead of reporting each other for minor infractions. We have potluck dinners and movie nights and community cleanup days. Property values are higher than they've ever been, but more importantly, people are happier than they've ever been. Those pink shutters are still there, still bright, still making people smile when they drive by. They've become a bit of a local landmark. Tour guides in the area actually include our house on their quirky neighborhood features tours. But to Sarah and me, there's so much more than a tourist attraction. They're a daily reminder that we don't have to accept other people's limitations on our lives. They're proof that sometimes the right thing to do is the bold thing to do. They're a symbol of the moment we decided to stop being afraid and start being ourselves. Every few months, I get a call from someone in another neighborhood, another city, another state, who's dealing with their own HOA nightmare. They want advice, support, maybe just permission to believe that fighting back is possible. And I always tell them the same thing: read your bylaws. Do your homework. Stand up for yourself. And remember, the people who try to control you are usually just as afraid as you are. They're afraid of losing their power, afraid of being challenged, afraid of being exposed for the petty tyrants they really are. Don't let their fear control your life. If you take anything away from this story, let it be this: you have more power than you think you do. The systems that seem designed to control you often have built-in ways to challenge them. You just have to be willing to look for them and use them. Margaret Henderson counted on my ignorance, my compliance, my desire to avoid conflict. She never expected me to fight back with her own weapons, the very bylaws she'd been using to terrorize the neighborhood for years. But more than that, she never expected the community to come together. She'd spent so long dividing us, isolating us, making each of us feel like we were alone in our frustration, that she never saw the coalition coming. That's the real lesson here: you don't have to fight alone. There are people around you who are dealing with the same problems, feeling the same frustrations, waiting for someone to make the first move. Sometimes, that someone has to be you. Sometimes, you have to paint your shutters pink. It's been 3 years since the Great Shutter War of 2024, and those Flamingos Revenge shutters are still the brightest, boldest, most beautiful shutters in the entire neighborhood. They've weathered storms, seasons, and even a few more attempts by Margaret to have them declared a community nuisance. Sarah and I still sit on the front porch every morning with our coffee, watching the sunrise and talking about our dreams. But now, instead of being afraid that someone might take those dreams away, we know that we have the power to protect them. And every morning, when the sun hits those pink shutters just right, they shimmer like a promise that this is our home, our life, our choice. Margaret Henderson. She moved to a different neighborhood about a year ago. I heard she's having some trouble with her new HOA. Apparently, they have rules about complaining too much.